All right, so let's take a look at our lab environment here for this course. What I wanted to do was keep this pretty simple for everybody so that you guys could replicate this in your own environment. Now, I've got 9200 series switches here. That could be any switch, even the older 3750 switches that you can get off of eBay for a few bucks. Now, the thing is Catalyst Center is going to be limited unless you get a newer type of switch and what it can do. So if you really want to test out Catalyst Center and SDA, we do recommend you get 9300 series switches in your lab. They are going to run you about $1,000 on eBay at the time of this writing of this course. But really, whenever you're investing in your future, it's not that bad, right? So the very first time I built a home lab, guys, was back in 97 or 96. And I took out a loan for $7,000 back then. I thought that was all the money in the world to buy a new PC, a new laptop, and a couple routers and switches. And they weren't the best quality back then. If you could imagine, I spent more money on the routers and switches just to get my hands on some stuff, right? And I think it was just a laptop and the routers and switches. But point being is you got to invest in yourself if you want to get a return. And if you've heard me talk, and I'm sure you guys have, but in a lot of my videos, investing in you is the best investment you can make, right? So I wanted to keep this lab as simple as possible. Now, you don't need two of those switches. You could get away with one, and you don't even need a physical 9800L as I have here. Those are going to run you about $1,000 as well, a couple $1,000. Honestly, if you do partner NFR program, they're still 2,500, 3,000, something like that. They're expensive. So you can do this with a 9800 cloud. You don't have to have physical appliances. So to go about this lab cheaper, I would just do one switch, do a virtual wireless LAN controller. You can do a virtual AD as we are doing. Catalyst Center, I do have a physical appliance. It's a Gen 2. ICE is a virtual image as well. But that's really, a good PC with a good multi-core processor, 64 gigs of RAM. You can run all of this stuff on your PC, and you just need a switch. Having a couple of extra NICs in your PC will give you the ability to have direct connections for all those appliances if you want. But even in our scenario, we've got one virtual server that runs AD, it runs ICE, and it runs our couple of our workstations also so that we can test things in the student pods. But long story short is I want to keep this very simple and sweet for the topology so that you guys could build a home lab very cheaply. Now, with Catalyst Center specifically, to manage the iOS XE switches, you need something that's iOS XE and above. And I'm pretty sure on that includes your Gen 1 switches. So they can manage the 3650 and 3850s all day long and help with those. But to do SDA labs with Catalyst Center, you would need like a 9200, 9300. You need at least one 9300 to do like a fabric in a box. So the 9200s wouldn't work for that. You need a 9300 for that. But you can still manage it. You can still manage the device with all the telemetry settings, and you can still get details and troubleshooting from your endpoints, all that kind of good stuff. You just wouldn't get that full experience without at least a 9300 series switch. Again, you don't have to have two of them, but getting one would be good. And I'm realizing talking about this, we'll probably write a recommended lab build, and so you guys can look on eBay or whatever and get it built out. But some of you hopefully have access to labs at work. If you don't, maybe you could or should, as you replenish stuff, especially, there's usually a lot of hardware that's left over. And I'm sure if you talk to your IT managers or your directors and say, hey, we really need a lab here, that they would invest in that because they want you to have the skills so that they don't have to outsource everything, right? So it's a very good ROI to have a lab at the office, but this is what our topology is going to be looking like for this environment. So we've got Active Directory for the AD type stuff. We've got ICE for the ICE stuff and the ICE integrations. And then we've got a Catalyst Center Gen 2 appliance that we're going to be using. If we go over to our CVDs, okay, so one of the things that you start learning as you become a Cisco certified professional, CCNA, CCNP, CCIE, through that journey is you realize Cisco has very good documentation most times about most things. especially how to rack and stack things and how to get things stood up, right? Now, it does take some time to get a comfort level with what's really required and what's really important versus what the guides say. If you follow this guide to a T, you're probably going to end up with a lot of interfaces you really don't need on a Catalyst Center, for example. And you're going to end up with some extra, networks you have to build where you may not need it, right? And I'm going to talk you through that. But CVDs are kind of a Bible if you haven't touched something before, to at least get a good foundation for what that should be to stand it up, okay? So we've got a Gen 2 second gen appliance, and this is release 237. So it all starts with plan, right? What you're going to need to rack and stack the box, all that kind of stuff. And it talks about IPs you're going to need, interfaces you're going to need, and it gives you a breakdown of where the ports are and everything. So it's important to know because you have some options, right? So some of these are 1 gig interfaces, some of these are 10 gig interfaces. So and then some you really don't, have to use, to be honest. Like I said, we'll talk about that. And it depends on the type of appliance you've got. So I've got this Gen 2 appliance here that we're going to be using, and that's the breakdown of the ports, right? On these bigger, large appliances, they call it small, medium, large kind of thing. This is the breakdown of the ports. They've got those additional expansion cards with the 10 gig ports, but these are really the primary interfaces. These are the secondary interfaces. So this is your primary, and these are your secondary interfaces. So just make sure as you're cabling that, and you don't have to cable both of them. It's one or the other. It depends on your topology and the level of redundancy you're going to be trying to use. But if you look here underneath your IP and subnets, you notice that enterprise port is required. Okay, cluster port is required. No matter if you're doing a cluster or not, you're still going to need to have an address for it. But your management port is optional, right? So that's your out-of-band management, right? CIMC port address is optional, but strongly recommended. Now, CIMC is your integrated management controller to manage the server independent of Catalyst Center, the installed application on the server. So it's always best to set up CIMC. That gives you an out-of-band management as if you're standing in front of the server. And then we've got a virtual KVM console that we can launch. We can do upgrades or repairs if we need to. Makes life much simpler dealing with Cisco servers if you have that. So I highly recommend that as required, not as optional. They strongly recommend it. I say it's required. So we really end up with, for small labs especially, we need an enterprise port address, we need a cluster port address, and then we need a CIMC port address. Okay, and that's its own little image. It's got its own little Linux kernel, its own little GUI that goes along with it, all of that kind of stuff. And then you get down here and there's some other things that you'll need: DNS, cluster VIP, all that kind of good stuff. And one of the things is a lot of people are like, well, I don't have a cluster yet. You would be amazed, guys, how many companies start with a single appliance, but eventually want to go to a full HA Catalyst Center stack. Okay, I've seen it many times. So plan as if that's what you're building, at least a single site Catalyst Center stack. Nowadays we have geo-redundant Catalyst Center stacks that we can do. Requires 3 nodes at 2 different locations, and also requires a witness be at a 3rd site that has access to both of those sites. So that's a lot more advanced. It's a pretty new architecture. Again, what you're planning for, what I recommend most people plan for, is just a single HA deployment, even if you're doing a single node deployment. So this is why there's that plan. And guys, we've done these, I've seen Cisco put out these training courses on just getting Catalyst Center cabled correctly and IP'd correctly, because it's confusing to people, right? So make sure you do go through this, and we've got a plan. You're going to see what I do in our example, but basically we're going to require this enterprise port, the cluster port. We're going to require the CIMC out-of-band IP address, okay, to manage the server. And that's actually how I'm going to do the day 0 setup of Catalyst Center. And then we'll have a VIP, right? Everything that's got a network, you're typically going to have a default gateway, of course, DNS servers, and you might need static routes. NTP servers are also very important. And then you'll have some containers that run on Catalyst Center, because Catalyst Center has a lot of these micro applications, microservices that run in the background. It's got one GUI that connects it all, but there's a lot of sub-services that Catalyst Center has. So you're going to want a large container subnet for those networks. And then if Catalyst Center is going to be your IPAM solution, meaning it's going to manage the IP addresses for the environment, you're going to need to have those specified as well, okay? Because Catalyst Center can be your IPAM solution as well, okay? Now, during the planning phase, a lot of these are going into data centers that have firewall rules and firewall protection for those servers. Absolutely get it. You need to create a new object on your firewall for Catalyst Center, and then that's where we plan which interface is going to be using to connect to these URLs. It will need to be able to download from these URLs, okay? So Cisco Connect DNA, CDN, Cisco Connect DNA, and then install.cisco.com is recommended as well for software uploads. You got to remember, guys, Catalyst Center is basically your enterprise network management system, okay? So what does that mean? That means we are taking care of your typical telemetry. So it's going to have an inventory of your enterprise network architecture, not your data center stuff necessarily, but all your routers, switches, things like that. Okay. Controllers, access points, firewalls could be, it's going to have all of that stuff listed in Catalyst Center in your inventory. It's going to have a network hierarchy that's based on your building hierarchy and where your sites are physically located at. Then you're going to have floors, maps, all that kind of good stuff. But basically, it's going to be there to manage your network, to help with software upgrades, okay, to help with configuration changes, all that kind of fun stuff. And then, of course, to report on how the network's performing, the health of it, right, the updates to it, all of that kind of good stuff. So Catalyst Center does a lot, and it's going to be connected to a lot. So it's important you take these URLs, you make sure that if you're using Cisco, Firepower, you're using Palo, whatever your firewall solution is, that you've put these URLs into a permit list for Catalyst Center to be able to reach. Now, some people get confused based on the cabling, which port's going to be used. So if you're using the internet port, that would be the port that's going to connect to all this stuff. If you're not using that port, that's going to be your enterprise port. Is going to be the one, enterprise interface is going to be the IP that reaches out, does all this stuff. So we'll take a look at that. And here are port numbers if you need to look at the port numbers that are between the different services. You're going to notice Catalyst Center outbound to devices. There's a lot. Okay. Again, it's an NMS. So it's going to need SSH access. Hopefully you're not using Telnet. You should not be using Telnet in a modern enterprise. It's going to need TACACS. It's going to need HTTP. It's going to need DNS, NTP, SNMP, HTTP, NetConf, Radius, and then ICE, all that kind of good stuff. And there's inbound and outbound port maps that you will be able to document as you plan your Catalyst Center deployment. So we are about to get to where we are going to install this appliance and this next workflow here. So just kind of working our way down, all right? So it's got some options for unpacking, inspecting the box, all that kind of good stuff. There's warning statements. And then it says, hey, check the LEDs. This is what your appliance will look like, of course. And then if you've got the large, that's what it looks like. Remember the cabling we talked about earlier. So we're using our primary interfaces here and not those secondary interfaces, okay? And then once we've got all that cabled, which we already do, and we're ready to go, then we can do prepare appliance for configuration. Now, you can either use a KVM and sit in the data center and do this setup and do it that way. What we are going to do is I'm going to go ahead and go in the data center. I'm going to set up the CIMC management interface, use the KVM cart to do that. But that's setting up the out-of-band server management interface. Okay, so we're going to power it up. We're going to physically cable it, all that kind of good stuff. And then we're going to get to the CIMC interface to where we continue our discussion here over the day zero setup of Cisco Catalyst Center. So with that said, we'll see you in the next video. Hope you enjoyed it.